Ernst Jünger's Storm of Steel. Chapter 10. In the Village of Fresnoy. On this occasion, the furlough, which I took up a few days later, was to remain uninterrupted. In my journal, I find the brief but eloquent sentence, "Spent my furlough very well. In the event of my death, I shall have no complaints." On the 9th of April, 1917, I was back with the second company, who were quartered in the village of Mrezhny, not far from Dawai. What took the edge off my pleasure at the reunion was consternation at being required to accompany the baggage train to Beaumont. Through showers of rain and driving snow, I rode at the head of a crawling column of vehicles, till we finally reached our destination at 1 in the morning. After men and horses had variously been found shelter, I went looking for quarters for myself, but could find nowhere that wasn't already taken. Finally, a commissariat orderly had the clever idea of offering me his own bed, seeing as he was manning the telephone exchange anyways. Even as I flopped onto it, still booted and spurred, he told me that the British had taken Vimy Ridge from the Bavarians, and quite a bit of land around. Kindly as he was to me, I could tell he was secretly resentful of the way his quiet village in the back area was being adapted to a meeting point for front-line forces. The following morning, the battalion marched off into the direction of heavy firing, to the village of Fresnoy. There, I received orders to establish an observation post. With a few men, I found a little house on the western edge of the village, and we knocked through the roof to make a viewing place. We set up residence in the cellar of the same building. As we were clearing it, we made the welcome discovery of a sack of potatoes to supplement our extremely meager supplies. Thereafter, I had Kniga make me boiled potatoes with salt every evening. Also, Gornik, now occupying the deserted village of Velleval with his platoon, sent me a few bottles of claret and a large tin of liver sausage, a comradely gift raised from the suddenly abandoned supplies in a food store. A booty expedition thereupon immediately dispatched by me, with baby carriages and similar conveyances to recover further treasures, was forced to return empty-handed, as the British lines had already reached the edge of the village. Gornik told me later that following the discovery of the cachet of wine, a spontaneous drinking session had ensued, even as the village was being bombarded, and that it had been difficult to reimpose control. In similar situations later, we were simply to shoot holes in barrels and carboys and other containers of alcohol. On the 14th of April, I was given instructions to set up an intelligence clearing station in the village. To that end, I had dispatch riders, bicyclists, telephone and light signal stations, and underground telegraph wires, carrier pigeons, and a chain of flare positions all put at my disposal. In the evening, I looked out a suitable basement with annexes, and then returned for the last time to my old lodgings on the west of the village. There had been a lot to do that day, and I was pretty tired. I had the impression that night of hearing a few dull crashing sounds, and of Kniga calling me, but I was too fast asleep that I merely muttered, "Oh, let 'em shoot," and turned over on my side, even though the room was as thick with dust as the chalk mill. In the morning, I was woken by little Schultz, Colonel von Uppen's nephew, shouting, "Good God! Do you mean to tell me you slept through that?" When I got up and surveyed the debris, I quickly realized that a heavy shell had exploded on the roof and smashed all the rooms, including our observation post. The fuse would have only had to been a little bigger, and they could have scraped off our remains with a spoon and buried us in our mess tins, as the grunts were given to saying. Schultz told me his runner had taken one look at the wreckage and said there was a lieutenant quartered in there yesterday. Better see if he's still there. Kniga was terribly impressed by my deep sleep. In the morning, we moved to our new basement. As we were about that, we were almost crushed by the debris of the church tower, which was unceremoniously, and without any prior notification, blown up by our engineers, to make it harder for the enemy artillery to get their bearings. In one of the neighboring villages, no one had troubled to warn a couple of lookouts who had been posted up their church. Miraculously, the men were pulled out of the wreckage alive and unhurt. That one morning saw over a dozen church towers in the area bite the dust. We settled it into our spacious cellar, and furnished it pretty much as we pleased. helping ourselves equally to items from the rich man's castle and the poor man's hovel. Whatever we ended up not liking fed the fire. Also during these days, there was a whole series of dogfights, which almost invariably ended with the defeat for the British, since it was Richthofen's squadron they were up against. Often 5 or 6 planes in succession would be chased out or shot down in flames. Once we saw a pilot tumble out with a great arc and come down separately from his plane. No more than a little black dot. Admittedly, looking up to watch was not without its attendant dangers. One soldier of the 4th Company was fatally wounded in the throat by a falling splinter. On the 18th of April, I visited the 2nd Company in their position in an oxbow around the village of Arleux. Bohe told me that so far he'd only had a single wounded man, since the pedantic preliminary bombardments of the British left ample time to vacate the target area. After wishing him luck, I left the village at a gallop, as heavy shells had begun to fall. When I was about 300 yards away, I stopped to watch the clouds thrown up by the spurting explosions, red or black depending on whether they'd struck brickwork or garden soil, and mingled with the soft white of bursting shrapnels. When a few clusters of small shells began to fall on the narrow footpaths linking Arleux and Fresnoy, I decided I'd seen enough, and cleared the field to avoid being a little bit killed, as the current expression in the 2nd Company has it. Such excursions, sometimes as far as the little town of Heidenlittad, were pretty frequent in the first fortnight, because, in spite of my large staff and resources, I was given no intelligence whatsoever to clear. Beginning on the 20th of April, Fresnoy came under fire from a ship's cannon, whose shells were winding up like a hellish hiss. Following every explosion, the village was wrapped in a vast reddish-brown cloud of picric acid gas, which mushroomed out. Even the dud shells were enough to cause a minor earthquake. One soldier in the 9th Company, who was caught by a shell like that while in the castle grounds, was launched high over the trees and broke every bone in his body when he hit the deck. One evening, I was on my bicycle, heading back down to the village from a local vantage point, when I saw the familiar reddish-brown cloud go up. I dismounted and stood in a field to wait for the bombardment to finish. About 3 seconds after each explosion, I heard the gigantic crash, followed by a vast twittering and whistling, as if a dense flock of birds were approaching. Then hundreds of splinters would come dusting the dry fields around. This happened several times, and each time I waited feeling half embarrassed, half simply nosy, for the relatively slow arrival of the splinters. In the afternoons, the village was under bombardment from all sorts of weapons and calibers. In spite of the danger, I was always loath to leave the attic window of the house, because it was an exciting sight, watching units and individual messengers hurrying across the field of fire, often hurling themselves to the ground, while the earth whirled and spat to the left and right of them. Peeping over Destiny's shoulder like that to see her hand. It's easy to become negligent and risk one's own life. As I entered the village at the end of one of these ordeals by fire, as that's what they were, I saw a basement flattened. All we could recover from the scorched space were 3 bodies. Next to the entrance, one man lay on his belly in a shredded uniform. His head was off, and the blood had flowed into a puddle. When an ambulance man turned him over to check him for valuables, I saw, as in a nightmare, that his thumb was still hanging from the remains of his arm. With each day, the bombardment became more intensive, and it soon seemed all but certain that an attack must follow. On the 27th, at midnight, I had the following telegraph message. 67, beginning 5 a.m., which in our code meant that from 5 o'clock tomorrow we were to be on heightened state of alert. I promptly lay down right away, so as to be up in the anticipated exertions. But as I was on the point of sleep, a shell struck the house, smashing the wall against the basement steps, and filled our room with rubble. We leaped up and hurried into the shelter. As we sat on the steps, by the light of a candle, tired and sullen, the leader of my light signaling troop, whose station had been destroyed that afternoon, including 2 valuable signaling lamps, dashed in to report, "Lieutenant, the basement of number 11 has taken a direct hit. There are some men buried in the rubble." Since I had 2 bicyclists, and 3 telephonists among them, I hurried over with some of my men. In the shelter, I found 1 lance corporal and 1 wounded man, and received the following report. As the first shells began to land ominously close, 4 of the 5 inhabitants decided to take it to the shelter. One of them ran down right away. One of them stayed in his bed imperturbably, and the other 3 sat down to pull their boots on. The most cautious man, and the most carefree, as is so often in war, survived, one of them being quite uninjured, the sleeper receiving a splinter in the thigh, while the other 3 were torn apart by the shell that flew through the basement wall and blew up in the far corner. Following this account, I lit a cigar and entered the smoky room, in the middle of which was piled almost to the ceiling a bolus of straw sacks, smashed bedsteads, and other furniture. After we sat down a few candles in the niches of the wall, we set about the sorry task. We seized hold of the limbs sticking out from the wreckage and pulled out the corpses. One man had lost his head, and the end of his torso was like a great sponge of blood. Splintered bones stuck out of the arm stump of the second, and his uniform was drenched with blood from a great wound in his chest. The intestines of the third were spilling out of his open belly. As we pulled him out, a splintered piece of board caught in the wound with a hideous noise. One orderly passed a remark and was rebuked by Kniga with the words, "Shut up, man! You don't waste words over something like this." I made an inventory of their personal belongings. It was a ghastly job. The candles flickered reddishly in the dusty air, while the men handed me wallets and rings and watches, as if we were a bunch of gangsters. Fine yellow brick dust had settled on the dead men's faces, and gave them the rigid appearance of waxen effigies. We draped blankets over them, and hurried out to the basement. Having first wrapped the wounded man in a tarpaulin, with the stoical advice, "Better grit your teeth, comrade," we dragged him through wild shrapnel fire to the dressing station. Once back in my lodging, I first of all took some cherry brandy to recover. Before long, the firing got worse again, and we hurriedly gathered in the shelter, having just been given a vivid demonstration of the effects of artillery on cellars. At precisely 14 minutes past 5, the bombardment, in the space of a few seconds, reached an extraordinary pitch. Our intelligence officer had been dead right. The shelter was shaking and trembling like a ship in a storm, while all around came the sounds of crashing walls and the splintering of houses nearby collapsing. At 7 o'clock, I received a light signal addressed to the 2nd Battalion. "Brigade requires immediate report on the situation." An hour later, a deathly tired runner came back with the news. "Enemy occupying Arlo and the Arlo Park. 8th Company ordered to counterattack. No news as of yet. Rochel, Captain." That was the single, albeit crucial, item of news that I was able to pass on with my big staff in the course of my 3-week stay in Fresnoy. Now, when my being there was of the utmost value, the artillery had put almost all my means of communication out of commission. I myself was caught like a rat in a trap. The setting up of this intelligence post had proven mistaken. It was a case of over-centralization. This surprising bit of news now explained to me why rifle bullets had been rattling against the walls for some time from fairly close. No sooner had we grasped the extent of the regiment's losses than the bombardment recommenced with full power. Kniga was the last man standing on the shelter stairs when a thunderous crash told us that the British had at last managed to score a direct hit on our cellar. The stolid Kniga caught a lump of rock on the back, but was otherwise unhurt. Above, everything was in pieces. Daylight reached us through a couple of bicycles that had been crushed into the shelter entrance. We retreated to the bottom step, while the continuing thud and rattle of masonry reminded us of the uncertainty even of this refuge of ours. As if by miracle, the telephone was still working. I informed the divisional chief of intelligence of our situation, and was given orders to withdraw with my men to the nearby dressing station dugout. So we packed up our few essentials and set off towards the shelter's alternative exit, which was at least still intact. Even though I didn't stint the threats and orders, The rather unbattle-hardened telephonists took such a long time to leave the relative protection of the shelter and expose themselves to direct fire that the entrance was hit by a heavy shell and collapsed with a great crash. It was fortunate that no one was hit. Only our little dog set up a howl and was never seen again. Now we have to heave aside the bicycles that were blocking the cellar exit, creep on all fours over the debris, and slip through a crack in the wall into the open. Without stopping to take in the unbelievable change that had come over the place, we headed out of the village as fast as we could. No sooner had the last man of us got past the front gate than the house took one more huge hit, and that was the coup de grace. The terrain between the edge of the village and the dressing station was receiving a total artillery barrage. Light and heavy shells with impact, fire, and time delay fuses, duds, empty cases, and shrapnel all participated in a kind of madness that was too much for our eyes and ears. In amongst it all, going either side of the witch's cauldron of the village, support troops were advancing. Fresnoy was one towering fountain of earth after another. Each second seemed to want to outdo the last. As if by some magical power, one house after the other subsided into the earth. Walls broken, gables fell, and a bare set of beams and joists were sent flying through the air, cutting down the roofs of other houses. Clouds of splinters danced over whitish wraiths of steam. Eyes and ears were utterly compelled by the maelstrom of devastation. We spent the next 2 days in the dressing station dugout, in conditions of great overcrowding, because in addition to my men it housed the staffs of 2 battalions, 2 relief detachments, and the inevitable odds and sods. The coming and going around the entrances, where there was a continual buzz of activity, as around a beehive, of course didn't go unnoticed by our opponents. Soon, wickedly aimed shells landed at 1-minute intervals on the footpaths outside, and the calls for the ambulance men were never ending. To this unpleasant bit of target practice, I lost 4 bicycles, which I had left next to the entrance. They were comprehensively remodeled and cast into the 4 winds. At the entrance, stiff and silent, rolled in a tarpaulin, his big horn rims still on his face, lay Lieutenant Lemire, the commander of the 8th Company, who had been brought here by his men. He had received a shot in the mouth. His younger brother was to fall only a few months later, hit in the same way. On the 30th of April, my successor took over from me with the relief regiment, the 25th, and we moved to Flers, the rendezvous for the 1st Battalion. Leaving the heavily shelled, lime-kilned Chesbontemps on our left, we strolled blissfully across the fields to Beaumont in the balmy afternoon. Our eyes once more appreciated the beauty of the earth, relieved to have escaped the unbearable constrictions of the shelter hole, and our lungs drew in the intoxicating spring air. With the rumble of guns behind us, we were able to say with the poet, "A day that God, the maker of the world, made for sweeter things than fighting." In Flers, I found my designated quarters had been occupied by several staff sergeant majors, who, claiming they had to guard the room on behalf of a certain Baron von X, refused to make room, but hadn't reckoned on the short temper of an irritated and tired front-line officer. I had my men knock the door down, and, following a short scuffle in front of the peacetime occupants of the house, who had hurried along in their nightgowns to see what the matter was, the gentlemen, or gentlemen's gentlemen, were sent flying down the stairs. Knigge was sufficiently gracious to throw their boots after them. After this successful attack, I climbed into my nicely warmed-up bed, offering half of it to my friend, Kius, who was still wandering around looking for an abode. The sleep in this long mist fixture did us so much good that the following morning we awoke, as they say, fully rested. Since the 1st Battalion had not lost many men during the recent fighting, the mood was pretty cheerful, as we marched to the station of Douai. Our destination was the village of Seraing, where we were to rest and recuperate for a few days. We had a friendly welcome and a good accommodation from the villagers, and already on our first evening the happy sounds of reunited comrades could be heard from many of the dwellings. Such libations, after a successfully endured engagement, are among the fondest memories an old warrior may have. Even if 10 of the 12 men had fallen, the two survivors would surely meet over a glass on their first evening off, and drink a silent toast to their comrades, and jestingly talk over their shared experiences. There was in these men a quality that both emphasized the savagery of war and transfigured it at the same time. An objective relish for danger, the chevalier-esque urge to prevail in battle. Over 4 years, the fire smelted ever purer, ever bolder warriorhood. The next morning, Knigge appeared and read out some orders, from which I understood that I was to take over the command of the 4th Company at around noon. This was the company in which the Lower Saxon poet Hermann Lohns fell in the autumn of 1914 outside Reims, a volunteer at the age of almost 50. This has been Chapter 10 of Ernst Jünger's Storm of Steel.